Okay, welcome everyone. It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Sharon Lohr as a 2021 guest speaker of the Winter Lecture Series organized by the Georgia chapter of the American Statistical Association. Dr. Lohr is a professor emerita of Arizona State University. She published widely about survey sampling, design of experiments, and statistical methods for education, public policy, law, and crime. She is the author of numerous articles in statistics journals and of the books Sampling, Design and Analysis, and Measuring Crime Behind the Statistics. Formerly Dean's Distinguished Professor of Statistics at Arizona State University and a Vice President at West State, she is now a freelance statistical consultant and writer. Dr. Lohr received numerous awards for her contribution. Just one second. Okay. Dr. Lohr received numerous awards for her contribution to the field of statistics. She is a fellow of the American Statistical Association and elected member of the International Statistical Institute and the inaugural recipient of the G.M. Cox Award for contributions to statistical practice. Other honors include being selected to give the Morris Hanson Lecture in 2009, the Deming Lecture in 2014, and Waksberg Lecture in 2021. We are truly grateful for her for agreeing to give the lecture today. As a token of our appreciation, we have a plaque to present her. Do you see it? Yeah, Dr. Plaque, this is the one. We'll mail it to you.
Thank you.
And without further ado, let me request Dr. Lohr to deliver the lecture. Hello.
Okay. Let me share my screen here. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in your winter lecture series. The slides and the references are available at this website in case you want to look at them or follow along or download them. And I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, if you would hold questions until the end, because I'll be happy to take them at that time. So 2020 marked the 125th anniversary of what I consider to be just a remarkable piece of statistical work. And this was the Hullhouse maps and papers published in 1895. And in these maps, the residents of Hullhouse displayed a small neighborhood in Chicago. And there were two sets of maps. The first, shown here, is nationalities maps. And in this, each house in the neighborhood was colored proportionately to the representation of the national origin of the families living there. And you can see immediately from here the clustering of different nationalities within areas in here. So here blue is Italian, yellow was Bohemian. You can see the segregation of the African American community in this neighborhood over here. The second set of maps was a set of wage maps, and it was similarly color coded. In this case, it was colored by the average, the total earnings per week of the families that lived in the different areas here. So in this talk, I want to just briefly review the state of statistics in 1890, just before these maps were drawn, and then talk about how did the women who were living at Hullhouse, in particular Florence Kelley and Agnes Sinclair Holbrook, get involved in statistical work, and how did they end up producing these maps? And along the way, I'll talk about some of Florence Kelley's other investigations, her investigations into sweatshops in 1892, her investigations into a smallpox epidemic in 1893. I then want to talk about some connections from this work, including a connection to statistics in Georgia at the turn of the 20th century. And then finally, a little bit about the legacy for today. So first, what was known about statistics in the 1890s? And here's the list in Steve Stigler's book on the history of statistics. I mean, certainly scholars and people who were involved in statistical research knew about the central limit theorem, even though the completely rigorous one didn't appear in print until 1901. They would have known about large sample z-tests to compare means, least squares, regression, variance components, correlation. But I think Stigler leaves out 4 incredibly significant developments in the last part of the 19th century. And the first one was a multi-volume set by Charles Booth. The first volume appeared in 1889, called Life and Labor of the People of London. And you can see here the inspiration for at least the wage maps of the Hullhouse maps. And he mapped poverty in the East End of London in this map. The second significant development I think of is the 1890 US Census. This was the first census to use electric tabulating machines. And in this cover from Scientific American in August 1890, you can see all of the steps involved in this processing. So in the upper right corner here, you can see a clerk punching the cards, and then the machine would extract the information on those cards. And an experienced clerk could process 80 cards per minute. And at the end of processing a card, the machine would tell, well, which category the card was in, so the clerk could put it in the sorting bin here to the right. And they had 2 shifts, which enabled the tabulations to be finished much more quickly. Women did the day shift, men did the evening shift. What happened? With better computing, this allowed statisticians to do more cross tabulations. And so this was a beginning of getting much more information out of the census and out of other data collections. The third development, which I think of as landmark, is Anders Kajær's 1895 speech to the International Statistical Institute on observations and experiences concerning representative enumeration. And this is the talk where he proposed using representative samples for official statistics instead of always needing a census. And at this meeting, some of the statisticians at the meeting were enthusiastic, but more of them were skeptical of this proposal. And they argued that you can't replace actual observations with calculations. And in fact, it took about another 40 years or so for the idea of probability sampling, using a sample in place of a population enumeration, to take hold in official statistics. And then the fourth development is the Hullhouse maps and papers, which was primarily the work of Florence Kelley, Agnes Sinclair Holbrook, who were living at Hullhouse at the time. So how did these women become involved in collecting statistics and creating statistical displays? Well, Florence Kelley came from an affluent and well-connected family. Her father was a founder of the Republican Party and a long-term congressman. Her mother came from a long line of Quaker abolitionists, and family friends included Abraham Lincoln and Susan B. Anthony. Florence Kelley was largely educated at home, and this might explain part of how she became interested in statistics, because at age 10, much of her education consisted of just reading books in her father's library. She started at the southwest corner and she just worked her way through it. And she read everything that was in her path: novels, writings from James Madison and Daniel Webster, government reports from the Library of Congress, because what child doesn't find those entrancing? And her reading prepared her well enough that at age 17, she was admitted to Cornell University, a member of one of the first classes of Cornell to admit women. And there she continued her reading of government reports. Her thesis at Cornell was on child labor. And as part of the research for her thesis, she read reports from the state bureaus of labor statistics. And her overwhelming impression from those reports was the, quote, deplorable meagerness of American official information about women and children in industry. The notable exception was a valuable report by Carol Wright, who was then the chief of the Massachusetts Bureau of Labor Statistics. After Cornell, she wanted to go do graduate study at the University of Pennsylvania. She was denied. She was also denied access to Oxford, and she ended up attending lectures at the University of Zurich, which was one of the few universities that admitted women to graduate study at the time. She became active in the socialist movement. She did a translation of Friedrich Engels' book on the condition of the working class, which became a bestseller. In 1884, she married a Russian socialist medical student. They had 3 children in 3 years. The family moved to New York City in 1886, where Lazar tried to establish a medical practice, and Florence continued writing. However, she was much more successful at her writing than he was at establishing a medical practice. He became increasingly verbally, physically abusive. And after one episode in 1891, where he hit her and he spat at her, she decided she was going to pack up the 3 children. She grabbed some household belongings and she took the train to Chicago. That's how she ended up in Chicago. And that's how she ended up in Hullhouse, the settlement house that had been founded in 1889 by Jane Addams, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize for this work, and Ellen Gates Starr. And a settlement house at the time was a house that was located in the community it served, and it offered social services such as child care, legal and employment aid, assistance on health, advice on sanitation, educational programs. And it was notable in that the social reformers, who were largely well-educated women from middle class or upper class backgrounds, they lived or settled in the community that they served. So for those of you familiar with Chicago, the gray rectangle here represents the area that they constructed in the Hullhouse maps. Hullhouse itself was just to the west of this area. And originally in Chicago, this consisted of single-family residences. But by the time that the maps were drawn, many of these residents in these areas consisted of multiple families. So in Chicago in 1890, here's a map from the 1890 census showing the death rates. The Hullhouse map area is this red square. And Chicago at this time was the fastest growing city in the world. It grew from 300,000 people in 1870 to more than 1 million in 1890. The 19th ward here, where Hullhouse was located, had extremely high population density. Most of the population of the area was immigrants from Europe, and it had a very high death rate. And many of these deaths were from infectious diseases. Florence Kelly settled there. In May 1892, she got her first official position as a data collector, as a special agent for the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the goal of this data collection was to collect a census of Chicago sweatshops to obtain information about the condition, the working conditions, and the conditions of the workers in those sweatshops. But she faced many challenges in doing this data collection. First of all, there was no sampling frame listing the shops. And many of the shops were small operations located in homes often, and they opened, closed, and moved all of the time. And in addition to these small shops, there was a large population of garment finishers who did piecework in their homes. And these also moved frequently from house to house as their financial circumstances changed. So it was a highly fluid population and highly mobile. Kelly actually did an early example of a snowball sample. She observed that the shops were highly clustered, and she began in areas that were known to have a high density of sweatshops. And from there, she and the other agents working with her extended their inquiries and the search for these often obscure places in every direction until no more could be found or heard of. And every clue was diligently followed up in order to make the enumeration as complete and full as possible. So she supplemented her original list with the high densities with shops that were listed in newspapers, that were listed by health department inspectors, and that were listed by other people that she interviewed. Hence the name snowball sample, because she accumulated the sample which grew like a snowball rolling down a hill. She also assessed the quality of the sample. Altogether, she found 666 shops and nearly 11,000 workers. But how many were missed? Well, here again, she was anticipating later developments. She did an informal capture-recapture estimate based on the outlying shops and the workers that were found, and ended up with estimating an upper bound of 800 shops, 13,000 workers. It's impossible to say now how accurate that was, but she was unusual in the time in attempting to count the number of shops and workers that she missed in the original data collection. And one thing we do know is that she probably did capture the majority of the shops within the major garment manufacturing areas. And she collected volumes of data on these, on the number of workers, on their wages, their working hours, the age, race, and sex, the types of clothing they manufactured, sanitary conditions of the shops, and on the disease and infections among the workers. She testified about this report to the legislature, and the result of her testimony was the enacting of the Illinois Factories and Workshops Act in 1893. And actually, she wrote most of this legislation, and the part of the legislation allowed for a new position, a factory inspector, to enforce the law. This position was offered initially to a man named Henry Demarest Lloyd, but he turned it down, and he recommended Kelly for the position, since she had, after all, written the legislation. And thus she became the first woman to hold statewide office in Illinois. And this led to the second of her data collections that I want to talk about today. And this regarded smallpox in Chicago, which, as in many of the cities at the time, was a big public health threat. And actually, in 1868, following a vaccination campaign, the city estimated that about 95% of the population had been vaccinated, and smallpox subsided for a while. But then, by about 1890, the vaccination rates declined. This occurred as unvaccinated persons immigrated to the city. The Chicago-born children weren't vaccinated at as high a rate because parents looked around and they said, well, I don't see smallpox here. Why do I need to vaccinate my child? And then the third event that led to perhaps the outbreak was the 1893 World Columbian Exposition. mean, some of you might have read the book, The Devil in the White City, about this exposition that brought about 25 million visitors to the city. And it's thought that one of those visitors brought smallpox with them. However it originated, 1893 and 1894, there was another outbreak of smallpox in Chicago. How did this come under Kelly's purview? Well, she was authorized by the Factories and Workshops Act to condemn and destroy infectious articles. And it was thought at the time that perhaps smallpox could be transmitted on garments. And so this was part of her job to try to control this. But again, she did not get cooperation from the garment manufacturers, and her statistical challenge, well, was how to measure and, if possible, control the outbreak. So she said her question, how to reach the relatively few wholesalers and through them the multitude of tenement house workers. She rejected the census that she had done for her earlier sweatshop investigation, because this was out of the question because of the large number of shops she might need to find and the other rooms that would be associated with those shops. She also rejected random sampling. And this again was because of the clustered nature of the outbreaks, where she said that a random search would be highly inefficient. So instead, she obtained lists of infected cases from the incomplete records kept by the Chicago Board of Health and from district physicians. She made immediate inspections of the shops near the case addresses. This was another use of snowball sampling, which actually contact tracing is snowball sampling, and an early example of adaptive cluster sampling, because she would look at the neighborhoods next to the ones where she had already found the smallpox. Here's a page from the report she wrote. She published a list of the shops on the streets with infections, and she also published the addresses where the infections were found. She observed the patterns in smallpox close to the sweatshops, and she identified the areas with high infection in the city. And in fact, her list was much more comprehensive than the list from the Chicago Board of Health. And she estimated the vaccination rate in the infected areas to be less than 5%. But of course, she noted that this was not an estimate of the vaccination rate in Chicago because her sample consisted primarily of infected areas. So what's the aftermath of her smallpox investigation? Well, she destroyed the infected goods, but she had no public health authority. And the Board of Health ignored her pleas for immediate vaccination of the area to protect the health of the residents. In addition, a lot of the communities in the neighborhoods ignored the smallpox notice cards, and they just went about their lives as usual. And in fact, she had difficulties in the data collection in that many people were concealing their children to keep them from being vaccinated in the area. So the long-term aftermath, the vaccination laws were obeyed only after the Illinois governor enforced it. However, these activities made both Kelly and the governor unpopular in the business community. He was defeated for re-election. The new governor fired Kelly. And after some other activities in Chicago, including part-time work at the University of Chicago Library, she ended up moving to New York as director of the National Consumer League, where until her death in 1932, she advocated for better working conditions. But what's less emphasized in her biographies, she also advocated better data collection and data collection that was done consistently from year to year. She wrote later, for example, "We are shamefully without adequate, trustworthy official figures showing the earnings of women in industry." And she advocated for use of statistics to guide public policy. So to get back to the Hullhouse maps, during this time of the smallpox data collection, and she also became involved in another statistical project. And this was initiated by Carol Wright, the US Commissioner of Labor, who was directed by Congress to make a full investigation relative to what is known as the slums of cities. And Congress told him to look at all cities with more than 200,000 people and appropriated the magnificent sum of $20,000 for this work. That's a little more than $600,000 in today's dollars, which of course were woefully inadequate for the task they were asking him to do. And he ended up restricting the data collection to small areas in 4 cities. He knew Florence Kelley from her work on the sweatshop investigation and from other writings. And he asked her to supervise the Chicago data collection. Kelley chose the small rectangle just east of Hullhouse because she was intimately familiar with the area. Between April and June 1893, 4 men from the Bureau of Labor collected the data. They turned their schedules into her at the end of the day. And before forwarding the schedules to Wright in Washington, D.C., the Hullhouse residents copied the data. Here's the report that Carol Wright wrote for Congress. You can see that it's for the House of Representatives at the top here. He had 500 pages of tables. And here's a typical table on the wages. And this is detailing the wages, the average weekly earnings, and the hours per week for different professions. And this is the professional page. So we have government officials, we have physicians and surgeons, we have organ grinders, and we have a number, just pages and pages and pages of these tables.
So the one thing is for
and in contrast, here's the Hullhouse wage map.
from the configuration
Yeah, I think someone forgot to mute their mic here.
for this specified
So
that's
could you please mute?
Yes,
Thank you.
I muted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So by contrast, here's the Hullhouse wage map. And you can immediately see much more information than you can from the tables in the official report. And moreover, you have the spatial information that you can't get at all from Carol Wright's report. But the details of this map were done by a new resident of Hullhouse named Agnes Sinclair Holbrook. I don't have a picture of her, unfortunately. She lived in Hullhouse from 1892 to 1895, and she's the one who copied most of the data. She did the details of the map design and coloring, and she also documented the data collection and how it was done in her map notes and comments in the Hullhouse maps and papers. So a number of data decisions in here. First one, what data to display? And the first decision, well, was done by Florence Kelley in deciding to collect the data from the Hullhouse neighborhood. But the Hullhouse neighborhood was mostly immigrants from Europe, and it had high poverty. So it made sense for them to want to display the nationality of the immigrants from Europe and to also look at the average family wage, which was also inspired from Charles Booth's wage maps. They also recorded data on the number of weeks unemployed, but they didn't end up writing a map on that. Second decision, how to display the data. And they made a number of modifications from Booth's wage map. The first improvement from Booth's map was on the data quality. Booth used conveniently available data. It was the recollections of school board visitors who were hired to enforce school attendance in London, and they collected the data from the families with school-aged children. His team interviewed the school board visitors and just colored the maps based on their recollections of the families that they had interviewed. For the Hullhouse maps, by contrast, they had professional data collectors. And the schedules asked what Carol Wright wanted to know about this. It was based on the 1890 census forms, which again is important for using data from multiple sources because the results could be compared directly with results from the census for those neighborhoods. And Holbrook wrote about the data quality. She said, "The facts set forth are as trustworthy as personal inquiry and intelligent effort could make them." And she talked again about the assessment of data quality, that not only was each house and room visited and inspected, but in many cases, the reports obtained from one person were corroborated by many others. She also talked about the experience from the expert in charge, that's Florence Kelley, to get at all particulars and with more accuracy. But despite the efforts for accurate data collection, she acknowledged that it is inevitable that errors should have crept in. And she talked about the measurement errors from the incorrect responses. And she talked about the dynamic nature of the neighborhood, that this was a static map, but occupations and residences were being changed all the time. Another improvement came from the color coding of the maps. And here I've enlarged the legend from Booth's map. I apologize, it's a little bit blurry here, but you can see that he has this subjective scale going from well-to-do to the very poor lowest class, who he categorizes as being vicious and semi-criminal. Note on Holbrook's map, by contrast, she uses an objective scale where she goes by the average wage reported in the schedules. Now, undoubtedly, some of these were inaccurate. But another thing that I really like about her scale is that she has a missing data category. The purple here is where she didn't know the wages of the family, and so she colored that in on her map where she didn't know it. Yet another improvement is the granularity of the data. For Booth, relying on the subjective impressions, each city block was one color. For the Hullhouse maps, Holbrook used proportional coloring within houses. So a house having two families making $7, one family making $12 would be 2/3 blue and 1/3 red. And this allows the viewer to see the degree of the within house homogeneity. But Holbrook also acknowledged one of the shortcomings of that coloring, because you would have the same coloring for a house that had two families at $7 and one family at $12, as you would have for a house that had 20 families at $7 and 10 families at $12. So the maps did not display the population density. She had really wanted to display population density, but she didn't see how to do it. And so she included the information about density in the text of her documentation chapter. So she wrote, for example, how in one basement room, 60 men would be sleeping at night while working in the area. So the statistical reasoning in her report in the Hullhouse maps and papers, what does she do? She wanted to display the data as accurately as possible. And here, note that she separated the data collection and the display from the advocacy work in some of the chapters of the book. She said her goal was to bring within reach of the public exact information concerning this quarter of Chicago. Advising methods by which it may be improved is done elsewhere. She documented all of the steps in collecting the data and making the graphs. She stated the limitations of the data, including the measurement errors. And she noted that these maps could be used to explore associations and correlations in the data. And you can do this fairly easily by just looking at the data and the maps side by side. And one of the things Holbrook noted in her report was that actually indirectly there was a display of population density, because she noted this very low wage area here in the first map, and that was because of the large number of families that were living in these houses. So now let's move on to some connections. And I promised you a connection with Georgia's statistics. And here's our link. It's the groundbreaking book by W.E.B. Dubois in 1899 on the condition of African-American residents of the 7th Ward in Philadelphia. You can see here one of the maps from his book. This is kind of a hybrid of the Hullhouse maps and the Charles Booth maps, because you can see he's using the scale here that Booth used, but he has the granularity of the Hullhouse maps. And what's his link with the Hullhouse maps? Well, the last 20% of this book was written by a woman named Isabel Eaton. She was a Hullhouse resident in 1893, and she collaborated with Florence Kelly on the book, The Hullhouse Maps and Papers, and she wrote one of the chapters for it. She also wrote a paper in the publications of ASA on the wages of the garment workers in the area, which was the foundation of her chapter in the Hullhouse Maps and Papers. So W.E.B. Dubois, around the turn of the century, he was employed as a professor at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University. And he was a lifelong correspondent and friend of Jane Addams, Florence Kelly, and Isabel Eaton. They co-founded the NAACP with him, and Kelly visited with him at Atlanta University. And where this comes into my story here is the exhibit that he did on African American life at the Paris 1900 Universal Exposition, where he expanded on these graphics from the Hullhouse Maps and Papers. And he just, you can see these from the Library of Congress. Here's the link. And you can also see them in just a splendid book called W.E.B. Dubois's Data Portraits. If you're looking for a holiday present for somebody interested in Georgia statistics, this is just a wonderful, wonderful book. And the first 32 graphics in this book are of statistics in Georgia. And let me just show you a few of these. So I downloaded these from the Library of Congress. And the first one here, this is a wage map, so similar to the ones that he had in his book on Philadelphia. And then you see a couple of bar charts on different topics. And then we have the color-coded map of the population of Georgia by different counties from 1870 and 1880, where you can see the population growth. Something called a serpentine bar chart. I love this chart, where he doesn't do that gap in bars that you see in misleading graphics. What he does for the last one is he kind of snakes it around so you can see that full length. And I've written about this elsewhere. A ziggurat chart, where you can see the marital status of residents in Georgia. And you can see that many more women are widowed than men here. And then another connection, and this is actually how I became involved in this area to begin with. Because I wanted to write a book for a general audience on how do you tell when a statistic you're reading is one that should be trusted, or how do you tell when it's one that you should not trust it at all? And in this book, I wanted to emphasize the general principles of statistical reasoning and that good statistics come from good statistical procedures. And to make this concrete, I used as my example crime statistics, because that's something that basically everybody is interested in and exposed to. And while doing the research for this book, I took a page out of Lynn Bullard's ASA presidential address. And I went through the early publications of the ASA, and I found this book review from December 1915 on a report called Statistics Relating to Crime in Chicago by Edith Abbott. And this report had not been mentioned in any of the historical papers on the history of crime statistics. And I thought, well, how come I'd never heard of this in any other reference, especially since it was well reviewed in the publications of the ASA. And it looked from this review that she was actually doing some of the things that we were working on at this time. She was, looking at how to combine data sources, and she was looking at the quality of the data. So I researched her a little bit, and it turned out that she had been selected as the statistician for the Chicago City Council Committee on Crime in 1914 and 1915. And she had this incredible statistical background, her PhD in economics. By the time she wrote this report, she'd already written 20 books and papers that heavily used statistics. And she was a Hullhouse resident, where she was one of the heirs of their long tradition of data collection and using statistics. And I read her report, and it just blew me away. It was so far ahead of its time as a model of statistical reasoning. And you could take her report from 1915 and basically apply it to statistics today. She argued just a compelling need for accurate statistics because they were needed to use police resources efficiently and to dispel myths of the day about crime. She used multiple sources of data in order to get a more complete picture, and then she also used them to evaluate the quality of the data sources. She looked at the effects and some of the implications of missing data, and throughout, she emphasized the importance of having good, sound data collection according to statistical principles. Because not only did that make statistics easy to calculate, it made them easy to communicate. So today, I think we're in a third era of the collection of social health and economic statistics. The first era I date from the founding of the country to about the 1940s, when basically all statistics were either collected by a census or they were just convenience samples. And then in the 1940s began the use of what I consider to be one of the greatest achievements of mathematical statistics, and that's the use of probability sampling. And just this amazing result that you don't have to make any assumptions about the population that you haven't seen, but you can still generalize from the sample to the entire population. But in 2021, we're in an era where response rates for surveys are declining. Everybody wants faster data. They want more granular data. And at the same time, there's more and more data sources available. And so some are advocating a return to censuses or the use of big data. So we're at a time now where I think we're facing the same problems that faced Florence Kelley and Edith Abbott. We need accurate data for public policy. And we're at a time where there are alternative sources for data. There are many more administrative records than Kelly and Abbott had available. In addition, there are all of these sources for so-called big data. Florence Kelly chose, rather than using a sample, to use granular data from a census for a small area. We now have granular data for large parts of a population, but for some of those data, we don't know their quality and we don't know how well they cover the population. And so we're in a time where, following Edith Abbott, we may want to use multiple data sources, which raises a lot of statistical questions on how do we best combine these and how do we assess their quality. So the legacy for today, I think, of Florence Kelly, the Hullhouse maps, and the other pioneers from the 1900s, several of them. First of all, I think the Hullhouse maps set a new standard for statistical mapping and doing statistical graphing. The book, I think, set a standard for transparency and documentation of the statistical procedures. They also assessed the quality of the data, and they were adamant about being faithful to the data. All of these researchers had sympathies with the people that they were studying, but they separated those sympathies from the data collection, and their goal for the data collection was to paint faithfully the character of the region and do a photographic reproduction. And finally, I think it is time that the statistical community claims them as statistical pioneers. So thank you very much. So let me end my sharing here so I can see all of you. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for the excellent talk.
That was great.
Do we have questions or comments?
Hi, Dr.
Sharon?
Sharon.
Gitanjali, please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Sharon. I'm Gitanjali. I'm doing my PhD in environmental economics, and I'm doing a secondary master's in statistics, because I believe in today's world, if you're not a statistician, you're really missing on something. So yeah, I just want to make a comment that I really liked your presentation. It was good to know a different part of the history of statistics. Really good to know the contribution of women in the field. Just super interesting work. I think you're doing good work. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Sharon, this is Barry Nussbaum. I love what you discussed, and as usual, you're excellent in melding history with statistical work. I think the key to what you have is in looking at the work that happened at Hullhouse and so forth is, and you've used the word many times, but I think you've got to, drill it home, is the quality. And my fear is that with big data, there's so much of it that you can't do that precision, look by look, side by side quality analysis, and that we fall into the trap of, gosh, there's so much of it. Does quality kind of lose out to quantity? So I think you did a good job saying quality, and I encourage you to keep saying it, because otherwise we get Simpson's paradox screwing up things, and we got all sorts of other difficulties. And I think we need more people like you pounding their fist and saying, yes, quality, and that's the key to it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, though, one of the opportunities we have right now, though, because we have more data sources, is that we can do a better assessment of quality by comparing the different sources. And it just really impressed me that here we're writing all of this stuff about combining data sources and using different sources to evaluate the quality now. And here Edith Abbott did that in 1915.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Stasny. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Elizabeth.
I just wondered what sorts of things she was doing to combine different data sources.
Okay, she had data from the police department, from the courts, from the House of Corrections. And what she was doing was basically saying, oh, look, these statistics from the different sources, they're inconsistent with each other. There's got to be some problem here. You know, there's got to be some problem when you have more people being convicted than you have being arrested. And that was a big part of her work. And then she also looked at the police records at the time, and she found that, you know, the inadequacies of those sources. So she was putting all of these sources together to try to trace the trajectory of people through the justice system of the time.
Hi, Sharon.
Hi.
Hi, this is Jonathan Auerbach. Great talk. One of the things that struck me about your talk, and I think also about David Friedman's paper on shoe leather with John Snow, is the willingness to put in the work, to put in the, you know, to go around and validate the data. Does that need to happen for us to this future that you point out with new and big data sets and maybe the death of the probability sample? Do we all statisticians need to go out and verify our sources and put in the shoe leather?
Well, somebody has to. I don't know if you personally have to go out and verify it all. But one thing I worry about is, and this goes back to, you know, my first class in graduate school out of Bois, Hunter, and I remember the opening example from that book where it comes from industrial statistics, and, you know, and the plant operator said, oh, here's some data, analyze this. You don't need to do a designed experiment to study what you're doing. And, you know, just use the conveniently available data. And I worry that with so many big data sources that's, you know, could take place again, that, oh, here's the convenient data. And well, yes, it's missing huge parts of the population, but, you know, we get most of it. And I don't agree with you that probability samples are dead. I think probability samples have a big role to play in this new data world. But, and in particular, for many, you know, hard to reach subpopulations, probability samples are the best information we have on that. There are some subpopulations, they're not well represented in administrative records. They're not well represented in other data sources. And for many of them, probability samples are the best way we have of capturing those subpopulations. So I view probability samples as having a big role in this data world, but we also want to expand it to include other sources as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I saw Steve Pearson a couple minutes ago with a question.
Hi, Sharon. So thank you for doing this. I also want to thank the Georgia chapter for hosting such a great presentation. This was really fascinating, so thank you. I think I saw how you came across Abbott's work, but I'm not sure I saw how you came across the work of Agnes Sinclair Holbrook. And I'm also curious. I know obviously I attended this talk, so I could learn about it here. I see you've written about this on your website too. Is it published elsewhere? Do you have plans to do that?
It isn't published yet, but a few people have said I should write this up. So I think I probably will and submit it somewhere. I actually became interested in Hullhouse because Edith Abbott had lived there, and she wrote about the previous data collections at Hullhouse, and I became interested in them. And so I then just traced this back in time.
Thank you for that. And I do hope you publish it somewhere. I'll second that.
That way you'd have a second book to recommend for holiday sales, right? You can include your own.
Actually, I have 2 books out now because my sampling book here, it just came in print so I figure if Florence Kelly can, read through the government reports for her leisure reading, what makes a better gift than a statistics book?
Which would be a crime, which leads to your other book, right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Lohr, very much for your excellent talk, and we will continue this lecture series next year.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Sharon.